I moved to Sweden a few years ago for personal reasons, but I was also hoping to get out of the intellectual rut of sitting in a busy London newsroom where everyone thinks the same, shares the same values and chases the same news stories. Sweden was terra incognita, and I had the advantage of speaking the language. I settled in the small town of Skara, far away from Stockholm. I settled in and settled down. It was a very happy time. The scenery was undramatic but beautiful, verdant, full of oak forests, and, for lack of a better word, old-fashioned. Despite being on the same latitude as the Shetland Islands, it was fertile. Large fields were watered by streams and lakes. There were 4 distinct seasons, with emerald-coloured treescapes in summer, fiery autumn foliage and deep snow in winter, before starting all over again. It felt like a somewhat more unspoiled version of parts of southern England, much less developed and populated, and with strange place names that reminded me of J.R.R. Tolkien's books. Local names like Alvum and Gudum, which literally translated mean home of the elves and home of the gods. Today, Alvhem is a village. Gudhem is barely a hamlet with an old church ruin. I was curious to know more about the local area and joined a local historical circle. The various skilled but amateur historians were dedicated and friendly and welcomed me into their world. They each had different areas of research. One pointed to the very high density of medieval churches and the fact that Sweden's early kings were buried in a church outside the town of Skara. That and various other bits of evidence were used to argue the case that this area was the cradle of Swedish state formation, not the Stockholm area on the other side of the country. Another local historian made the case that the historical setting for the mythical Beowulf, the ancient hero of the 7th century Anglo-Saxon epic, which is one of the most famous works of literature in the English-speaking world, was located nearby too. Finally, and perhaps most intriguingly, one historian argued that Asgard, the dwelling place of the old Norse gods, was located in the region too, not Iceland, Norway, Germany, or the Stockholm area, as has variously been suggested. In the myths, Asgard was a landscape dotted with palaces that included Valhalla, Odin's dwelling, famous for being the place to which Scandinavian warriors slain in battle were brought by the Valkyries. The slain warriors practiced fighting all day long and drank mead in the central hall every night in anticipation of the final battle, Ragnarok, when they would assist the Norse gods in their apocalyptic battle against the forces of evil.
Det står ju faktiskt i den poetiska Eddan, Tund tjuter. Det är precis vad en varg också gör. Och jag tror att man då kunde associera tjutet ifrån det här vattenfallet och klippan som stack upp med Fenrisulven. Där ligger Fenrisulven fjättrad ända till Ragnarök när han ska komma loss och hela världen ska gå under.
Was it really possible to see these landscapes on which the ancient Norse imagination had projected their mythology of gods, heroes, and evil beasts? The gods were not real, of course, but the place where the myths were formed must have been real, just as the Egyptian deities had their origins in the beliefs of the ancient Egyptian farmers. Was Western Sweden, as it were, the ancient Norse people's equivalent of the Nile Delta? These local historians' claims were worth checking out. They told me their extensive claims for this hitherto neglected part of Sweden had been disparaged by what they called the Stockholm establishment cabal of credentialed historians. But to me, that does not necessarily mean that what they were saying had no merit. I thought my local historian friends, so sneered at by the historian elite in Stockholm, were onto something. It was tantalizing. If the Asgard myth could be nailed down to a particular location, this little-known part of Sweden could become world famous. The elites of Stockholm could have their arrogance tweaked, Goliaths defeated by the despised Davids of the local historical clubs. And I could get $1 million to complete my documentary, with more evidence laid out, more interviews made, better production qualities. After all, the Hollywood film of Thor the Avenger cost $150 million and raked in 3 times that. Most of it was CGI and other fakery. People want authenticity these days, and this is the real thing. These runestones, one of which is dedicated to Thor, the thunder god who captured Loki, are 4 times as old as the United States itself. Contrast it to this. The Loki TV series, on its 2nd season at the streaming network Disney+, costs millions of dollars, with many millions of viewers, and shown around the world. Advertised here at a bus stop in Skara. But Skara itself, or rather the town's political officials and cultural officials, are not interested in the mythological gold mine in their own backyard. I think about this when I attend the annual graduation ceremony in Skara. It is a Swedish coming-out tradition for youngsters when they finish high school, always held in early June. It is a bitter-sweet event, as one takes stock of one's own life up to this point, at the same time as one thinks about the resources these youths have been, or haven't been equipped with, by their elders. The local teens and 20-somethings get their own mythology mediated back to them via a dream factory located thousands of miles away, and they are completely unaware of what is situated on their own doorstep. We are going to upset people's understanding of the origins of some of the wellsprings of British beliefs, and we will use a little-known poem in the tales of the old Icelanders, the Edda, to do it. The Edda poems, as every educated Brit knows, were the old Icelandic tales dealing with the ancient gods and their doings. But as this documentary will show, it is more complicated than saying the poems came from Iceland. Actually, none is geographically precise, and even Grimnis Mal only offers clues, as if the old poets are writing riddles to taunt us. But those clues are pretty obvious in what they exclude. In this quest to find something, our first step is going to be to exclude something, and our first exclusion concerns Iceland. It is easier to refute something than to prove something, so we will start here. Sorry, Iceland. The Icelanders are noisy and prominently possessive custodians of the Old Norse literature. Their whole tourist industry depends on it. But it is clear that Iceland, at least, cannot be the very original source of the myth. Just examine the 54 stanzas of the Grimnis Mal poem. It speaks of the small cresting wavelets of a calm sea, wild grasses, squirrels, deer, ash trees, woods, plains. None of these things can be found in Iceland, a volcanic ice desert battered by Atlantic gales. There is barely a tree on Iceland. let alone a forest, and no native mammals. Even if Iceland was the place where they were retold, recorded and passed on to modern audiences. Compared to mainland Scandinavia, Iceland was a place of relatively late settlement, to which Norway and Sweden sent their outlaws and criminals, a kind of Viking version of the penal colony of Australia. But where in mainland Scandinavia did the Norse god myths take place? Because of the ash tree's distribution, it has to be southern Sweden or southern Norway, but there are also descriptions of mountains, which excludes much of that part of Sweden, the southern part of Sweden, where deciduous trees like ash trees and oak grow. Western Sweden has an important waterfall, and it has plateau mountains, if not real mountains. But these plateau mountains, barely 100 meters high in some cases, have interesting features from a mythological perspective, and that helps us in our quest. There are actually about 15 plateau mountains in Västergötland, some seen here in these paintings by local 19th century artists, but we will just focus on Halleberg, which has mythological associations the others don't have. What is so special about Halleberg? Well, it is not the biggest or highest or the most beautiful of Västergötland's 15 plateau mountains, but it is well located for myth purposes. Here it is, in relation to Sweden's and Western Europe's largest lake, Vänern. Here it is on an old map, on the upper right-hand side. There is the nearest town, Vänersborg, the Göta River on the left, and then the entrance valley to Halleberg's immediate south, through which a modern road and railway run today. By the Göta River are the Trollhättan Falls, once Europe's largest waterfall, now dammed up and with a hydropower electricity generating station on top of it. Here on Google Maps you can see Halleberg, the candidate for Valhalla's larger geographical setting, in front of Sweden's largest agricultural plain, the former largest waterfall in Europe, now dammed up, and the Göta River are just to the far left in the picture. Their proximity to Halleberg is important because of the large number of stories featuring the Norse gods and waterfalls and rivers. Skara, Sweden's second oldest town, an old cathedral town where I live, is about an hour's drive away. This plain was underwater during the last ice age, when the meltwater from the retreating ice created a channel between the North Sea and the Baltic. After the land rise, when the channel shrank to become the Vänern Lake and Göta River, this landscape was very flat and very fertile, and as a result, this became ancient Sweden's main area of mass settlement. Most of Sweden's Stone Age and Bronze Age graves and monuments are found in Västergötland, and most gold finds too. Many people lived here. They could see Halleberg in the distance. In this heavily inhabited area, it is inevitable that myths would be generated and grow here. This table mountain, Halleberg, looks far from dramatic compared to the more dramatic landscapes of Iceland or the fantastic visual constructions in hero comics or in Hollywood of the dwellings of the gods. But we are talking real-world origins of the myth here. This is not some rubber foam model of a mountain created in some Californian studio. This is the real thing. This is like Stonehenge, but with more commercially successful spin-offs. The key to unlocking the mystery of where Valhalla sits is in one of the poems of the Elder Edda, written in around the 10th century. The background of the poem Grimnismal is that, disguised as an elderly man in a cloak, a soft hat and a staff, Odin often travelled around in disguise to test the people of Middle-earth. One day he decided to test his foster son, King Geirrod, on his morality and hospitality. Looking unprepossessing, he turned up at the king's court. Odin would not say much of himself when questioned, and because his wife Frigg a goddess, had earlier sent a messenger that warned of a wizard who would arrive to cast a spell on the king, and would be identified by the fact that the dogs would not attack him, which they did not. Odin was placed by King Geirrod in a dungeon and surrounded by 2 crackling bonfires for 8 days. The fires singed the god's cloak and created great thirst. Only one person saw to him, Geirrod's son Agnar, who provided him with water. As the son was displaying some promising moral qualities, Odin in disguise started to telling a story. He described the real nature of his father's kingdom, which he called Gotnaland, a land that contained Asgard, where gods lived, each in their own homestead, including the greatest of the gods, Odin himself, whose place was Valhalla. He described the geographical appearance of the lands and predicted that the boy would become king of these lands, and then, in the final stanza, announced his true nature. He was the king of the gods himself. Geirrod, down in the cellar now with his son, realized his huge mistake on not offering unconditional hospitality to the stranger, being too suspicious, fell on his sword and died. As per Odin's prediction, the son became king of Gotnalandi, which is probably Västergötland. Grimnismal is a strange poem, which is an interesting morality tale in itself, including the moral ambiguity of Odin's wife's intervention. But what is interesting for our purposes is the several stanzas that describe the relationship to the kingdom of Gotnalandi, second stanza, and where Odin and his fellow gods fit in, and simply how the place looked. In one line, the anonymous author of the poem describes Valhalla as glimmering bright and stretching, far out of the landscape of Middle-earth. Halliburg does indeed appear like a golden band in the late afternoon sun, and, while not particularly dramatic, is the main landmark in the developed floodplain that has long been one of Scandinavia's most densely populated farming landscapes. Even today, as you get closer on the approach, you see the Table Mountain consisting of 2 parts, and that the promontory of the southern part that extends over the entrance to the valley that bisects the mountain seems to retract as you approach from a certain angle, like the opening of a gate. One translation of the vital stanza reads like this: "There Valgrind stands, the sacred gate, and behind are the holy doors. Old is the gate, but few there are who can tell how it tightly is locked." The Swedish translation is subtly different. Valgrind den heter, som Varsnas på slätten Valgrind, which is the accepted name for the gates to Valhall, is perceived on the plain. The English translation does not have that important detail. And then this: Fornoldriga grinden, ancient is the gate, phrased in such a way as to suggest it is as ancient as the mountains. So the gates are a natural feature, indeed an illusion of perspective of the way 2 rocky promontories are placed in their mutual relation. You cannot figure out how it is locked, precisely because it is not a physical gate. As you approach the valley between the 2 hills, by asphalt road and car these days, and drive through it and stop, you will see that the side of the plateau mountain rises up from the road by maybe 60 or 70 meters. There are far more dramatic landscapes in many places around the world, but let the poem do its work. According to Hansen's and other local scholars' interpretation, what we have before us is the outer encircling wall of Valhall, the palace of Odin and his brave warriors. Stanza 9 in the Swedish translation of Grimnismal speaks of how at Valhalla, spear shafts provide the pillars, shields cover the roof. Characteristic of Halliburg is that large portions of the Table Mountain consist of diabase, a kind of hardened volcanic rock which lines up in vertical structural columns as seen here, and that could be taken for pillars or spear shafts. Not only does it look like a massive number of spear shafts holding up the plateau mountain, but on closer inspection you can see the faces of soldiers wearing helmets. I cannot believe this did not excite the imaginations of people 1500 years ago. Man remains the same, and the need for stories, legends, and outlets for his imagination is constant down the eras. There was no television, nothing to make us blasé. The ancient imagination was hungry for any kind of visuals on which to build. Along the several-kilometre stretch of rock wall, there must be hundreds of what can be interpreted as carvings of faces, strangely Easter Island-like, threaded into one another and overlapping, looking resolutely out at the landscape down the aeons. To my mind, it is easy to imagine that ancient travellers, primed to believe that these are the lands of the gods, came to imagine that these petrified warriors holding spears actually were the warriors of Valhalla, waiting for the day when they would be asked to prepare to fight the forces of evil. The piece de résistance of this rock wall is Odin himself, whose appearance makes a showing a few weeks a year when the sun falls at a certain angle, and that again is reflected in the Grimnis Mal. The 10th stanza goes as follows. Easy to recognize for all who come there is Odin's lofty hall. The wolf lurks before the west door, the eagle hovers above. In Swedish let dig alla, som till Odin komma, känna skinnet of hans sal. The Swedish translation carries the sense of, when you arrive at Valhalla, it is easy to feel Odin's presence, not in the sense that he is directly visible, but his presence is felt indirectly. On most days, the rock face is just a grey, flat area. At a meeting I had with local historian Lennart Hansen, he told me that a few weeks of the year, in certain low light, when the angle of the sunset is lined up with the southwest to northeast direction of the valley between Halleberg and its sister cliff to the south. The light falls at a particular angle at a particular part of the rock wall to create an almost three-dimensional figure with a human, beardless, not very attractive face and an eagle with its beak positioned above the face. One eye is damaged, one is healthy, just like Odin, who sacrificed his eye to attain wisdom. Above Odin's face is an eagle's head, its beak lit up by the setting sun, its eyes the two black indentations in the rock face. To believe, one has to use the imagination. It took me a while to locate the actual part of the cliff he meant, but I was there one sunny late afternoon in March, and lo, the face and eagle did appear for an hour or two in the orange twilight before the sun's light disappeared. Naturally, I both filmed and photographed it, and once I had seen it, I could not unsee it. Once I knew where to look. How many hundreds of motorists drive down this valley every day, though, and don't notice Odin in the cliff face? And I guess that had I never been told, I would not have found it, and indeed, scoping out, even in this sunset hour in the month when it is supposed to be visible, it is barely apparent. But remember, Grimnis Mal is a riddle. There was one mystery. Where was the wolf mentioned in the stanza of the poem, lurking before the west door? Maybe it was to the left of the Odin and the eagle, but I did not see it. After a long period of searching, I realized some lateral thinking might be needed. Let us head back west, past the west door, which is the entrance to the valley, to the Jota River Trollhättan Falls area. Ragnarok is where the forces of evil, led by a banished Loki, will rise up and defeat the gods. There is the fire demon Surt, the Middle-earth serpent, who has already had his fights with Thor, and then there is Fenrir, the giant wolf who has been tethered to a rock for many ages, snarling and salivating. In Edda lore, perhaps it was this rock that lay in the middle of the falls, these Trollhättan Falls, that come from the Lake Venner upstream and turn into the Jota River downstream. And the fact that his jaw was kept open by a sword placed there by the Norse gods, as seen in this drawing by the famous Swedish artist John Bauer, is what makes him dribble. That saliva is the Jota River itself. And Fenrir, which according to one interpretation means monster of the water or the monster of the lake, lies out at Lake Vänern. Take a look. The Vänern Lake does indeed look like a giant wolf in profile. But while the people of the area, indeed the whole of mainland Scandinavia, had no experience of volcanic eruptions, they would know of the perils of water flooding from the Lake Vänern, which inundated the land every decade or so, and so perhaps proved a foretaste of the Ragnarok to come. Maybe the Fenrir wolf was the most feared of all, and this wolf was hanging west of the door, or the entrance of the valley, as per the Grimnismal poem. In one admittedly complicated interpretation, there could be reference in Grimnismal to the god Heimdall and the rainbow bridge he guards, spanning over the Jota River. Rainbows, of course, would often have been seen over the mist and spray producing Trollhättan Falls, and on the left bank of the Jota Elv is a parish that is today called Naglum, but until the 13th century was called Naflim. Does this not give a hint to the area's name in pre-Christian times? And is it a coincidence that this sounds like Niflheim, the land of the dead, described in extenso elsewhere in the Edda poems, the land of primordial ice and cold, and of frozen rivers? In wintertime, with the largest waterfall in Europe frozen and silent, it must have been a sight. Is this the definitive proof that Valhalla was located in this part of Västergötland? Or is it just local scholars' Rorschach test imaginings? The first thing to say is that we do not know the origins or the relationship of Grimnismal to the rest of the Edda works. For instance, we could imagine the place where the world of the gods was elsewhere, but then local Viking Age scholars from Västergötland made a poem that made their province out to be a good fit, out of a sense of provincial patriotism. The original site for the mythology was perhaps elsewhere in Northern Europe, but it never had its chronicler, or maybe it was lost in the mist of time. That is one possibility. Really, there are some answers that we will never have. Did the mythology develop and mature at a single particular geographical space and time, from a few poets living and working together? Or did the stories of the Edda grow in different places, mutate, spread, colonize other areas of the Norse world, come together, diverge again under local influences, creating different perspectives much like the forks of a computer programming system? Local scholars say the story of the Grimnismal at least has a feel of a locally based myth. Everything fits. That is not quite true. There are many aspects of the cosmos of the Old Norse world that are not referenced at all. But these things are worth talking about, and the case for Västergötland's possible centrality, with all the caveats, should be allowed to be made to an audience without the prejudice that these are local, non-credentialed historians making the claim. A final point. Snorri Sturluson was an Icelandic writer and politician who compiled what is today known as the Prose Edda. It contains various references to the poetic Edda, of which Grimnismal is part. The Prose Edda is a more analytical work, and parts are written in prose. Unlike the anonymity and mystery surrounding the poetic Edda, Snorri indisputably wrote this, the prose or younger Edda. He was indisputably from Iceland, and he lived in the early 13th century, although as a youngish man he travelled to mainland Scandinavia, mainly Norway, but also, note this, Skara. Skara must have been an important place for contacts for an up-and-coming young Icelander, and for myths as he went there to compile tales about his ancestors, while he did not go to Uppsala or Sigtuna in eastern Sweden. At the beginning of his work, the Prose Edda, which was a favourite with Auden, Snorri cites a poem that does not feature in the Elder Edda, so Snorri's recitation of it is all we have. Odin and his warriors have arrived from Asia and have settled in the town of Odense, on the island of Fyn. The town exists today. It is one of Denmark's largest towns, and it did indeed get its name from the Norse god. Snorri, as a Christian at a liminal period of religious transition, was very keen to show that the Norse gods were not gods at all, merely fierce warrior kings from Asia who had imposed themselves on the local population and made them believe that they were gods, when in fact the only god was the Christian god. Then, in my view, Snorri confused things by allowing these faked-up warriors from Asia, pretending to be gods, to do superhuman things. Odin is fed up with living in Denmark and instructs his daughter-in-law to scoop a lake out of the territory of Sweden with the help of 4 supernaturally strong oxen attached to a plough. There is actually a fountain in Copenhagen today in honor of this myth, complete with 4 oxen, called the Gefjon Fountain, after the name of the ample woman who is Odin's daughter-in-law. This scooped-out land is then placed next to the island of Fyn, and Odin goes and settles by the lake in Sweden. Snorri makes it clear that the outline of the island next to Fyn is identical to the outlines of the lake that has been created in Sweden. The island next to Fyn exists today. It is Denmark's most populated island. Copenhagen is situated on it and is known as Zealand in English. Here it's Zealand in outline. Is there a lake in Sweden that resembles Zealand? There is. It is Lake Vänern. So Snorri is basically saying that Odin, after leaving Fyn, settled by the Lake Vänern, which fits in with everything we have read from another source, written in another era, namely Grimnis Mal. That this lake is simultaneously the shape of a wolf. Well, it could be both. If the myths come from different sources, there is bound to be this kind of collision. Strangely though, scholars from the Stockholm area insist that the lake Odin settles by is Lake Mälar, which does not resemble Zealand at all, but which has the advantage of putting Stockholm right at the center of the Norse myths. Stockholm is the center of Swedish political progressivism and liberalism, full of people with opinions who want the rest of the Swedes to do as they say, mainly in relation to having modern views. At the same time, they are very jealous about claiming centrality as regards ancient Norse mythology for themselves as well. There was a personal angle to all this. I had been alienated and burnt out by London. London is not about attending awards ceremonies and shopping in Bond Street. Well, it is for a few, some of the time. Most of the time, for most people, London is something like this. Commuting, crowds, traffic, hustling. I was looking for something new, but maybe I was looking for something I had lost. After spending a childhood in Sweden, I had come to an English school and done unremittingly hard subjects, and then plunged into the world of journalism, with the miserable zero-sum world of geopolitics my daily fare. There was also the depressingly equally important world of office politics to contend with. There was little time left for play, and going back to Sweden and finding myself by accident in the land of the sagas, I felt some of my playful self restored, that teenage part of me that had got lost in fantasy literature. I had been a great fan of Tolkien, the world's best-selling writer of fiction. His Lord of the Rings I see now is an elegy that works on several levels. In the book, an alliance of noble men, hobbits, elves and dwarves and wizards try to destroy the One Ring of Power, because if Sauron, an evil demonic figure, gets his hands on it, the world will end. They try to succeed even though they know that, having destroyed the ring, the magic that upholds all the good things in Middle-earth will also fade away. The elves will have to leave Middle-earth and sail away to the undying lands. Eventually, Tolkien foresaw that Middle-earth would evolve into the Europe we see today. No magic, no wizards, no elves, but a lot of humans and a lot of technology. It is a book about loss, of losing important things as the price of victory, and reflects Tolkien's and his generation's feelings about a battered England after the First World War. A lot was lost, and England faced a world of technological progress and human alienation. It also reflects some of the sense of loss about growing up. The Norse myths did not much interest me back then, and I did not know much, but I realize now just how much Tolkien owed to the Norse mythology. The period feel, the existence of magic weapons, the demons and dragons, and hopeless but courageous Norse heroism. He borrowed a lot from Odin when creating Gandalf, the powerful but humble-looking wizard who occasionally guides directly and occasionally assists from afar the ring-bearers. Even if hobbits were the main ring-bearers, Gandalf was really the strategic general of the forces of good, who were simultaneously planning a conventional battle against Sauron, that is, Sauron's orc armies, at the same time as the ring quest was taking place. Gandalf, like Odin, knew that the old ways would die, and that it was inevitable, but that the preparations against Sauron must go on. Ragnarok is a very elegiac event, tinged with sadness, especially as it was predicted and foreseen. Odin, having been told by the seeresses that the world would go under, had done everything he could to prevent it by amassing a huge army of the bravest Viking warriors, brought after their death on the battlefield to his dwelling, Valhalla, by Valkyries, and Odin had kept the warriors entertained, trained for war, and fed to give the gods a chance when the evil creatures rose. When Ragnarok came about, signaled by 3 winters that arrived without a summer, during which time the sun was useless, followed by years of small wars where brothers killed brothers, the warriors of Valhalla gathered on the field in front of Valhall, led by Odin wearing chainmail of a golden material and standing fast with his magical spear Gungnir in his grip. As the arrival of the end of the world was signaled by the last sad warning sound from Heimdall's horn. Led by Loki, the devils marched from the land of fire, pushed Heimdall off the Rainbow Bridge and marched towards Valhalla, where they scythed a line through the warriors. The Middle-earth serpent rose from the big sea outside. The wolf Fenrir rose from the small sea, the lake, snapping the chains that kept him tethered to the rock in the waterfall, and swallowed the sun and then the moon. The walls of Valhalla crumbled. The Middle-earth serpent killed Thor. The fire demon Surt killed the god of fertility Frey, and Odin was killed by Fenrir himself. The monsters themselves were killed by other gods, but at the end of the cataclysm was just a void. For a while, 2 humans and some of the lesser gods survive on the idyllic meadow landscape of Idavol to repopulate the world, but it still represents an immense loss. Today, incidentally, the real place where Idavol was located in the myth contains a train line and a second-hand car scrapyard. Swedish railways built a track right through this holy valley, forcing the partial destruction of a large ring of runestones almost right below the Odin face, a ring that Hansen argues was the place where the Norse gods had their daily council. Cultural vandalism, of course, in the name of creating a modern world, and there is an interesting connection to Tolkien. Tolkien was worried about progress and the things that were lost. As a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, he obsessed over the fact that the English, more than other peoples, had been cut off from their roots. When the Normans invaded, much of the Anglo-Saxon literature was destroyed or lost and replaced by texts in French. Tolkien was impressed that scholars all over 19th century Europe, like the Brothers Grimm in Germany or Runeberg in Finland, had collected old myths and fairy tales, handed on orally, and written them down to remind their peoples of who they really were. Because of the Norman invasions, because of a uniquely early industrialization and a uniquely large empire, on top of a devastating First World War, the English had lost their sense of self, their ties to the past, more than any other people, and he used the repurposed Norse mythology that we see in Lord of the Rings, because he felt this was the literature and mythscape the Old English, culturally related to the Scandinavians, had had before the Normans took over and obliterated much of the old culture. He must have been onto something, because poll after poll shows it is the most loved book among the English public. But The Lord of the Rings is more universal than that, as it reminds us as individuals not to lose touch with that country that is our childhood. Tolkien made it explicit in his essays on the importance of fairy tales. He calls it enchantment, and it is about the magical, creative, meaningful worldview we inhabited as children, which retains a lasting importance to us, as a driving factor even as we enter the more demanding, logical and rational adult world. Enchantment is supposed to be the state not only where prepubescent children permanently reside, where we have the capacity for wonder, and where we basically believe in magic, where cause and effect does not operate like it does, but also a state occupied by primitive man. It is this world we return to when we read a fairy tale. Tolkien makes the feeling of enchantment more obvious by letting the characters, the hobbits, which are proxies for the normal man, for the reader, undergo a process of enchantment themselves in the course of the narrative. Not only is the reader enjoying the process of enchantment by the very act of reading the book, he reads about characters entering a process of enchantment by entering a more dangerous world. The first part of Lord of the Rings deals with the normal world, where the most important thing happening in the world of the Shire is Bilbo's upcoming birthday celebration. That is the normal world of gossip or trivial comfort and regular tea times. Then Frodo, and therefore the reader, is introduced by the Odin figure, Gandalf, into a world of adventure and danger just beyond the Shire's borders. Like all traditional hero stories, the hobbits, going on their ring quest, are tested, become better and stronger and changed, and come back to the normal world improved. There are 4 hobbits who are members of the Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo is Bilbo's nephew and main ring-bearer. By the end, he is as traumatized as a veteran of the First World War trenches and sails over the sea. Sam is his faithful, simple but good-hearted manservant, of the type Tolkien would have known in the army. Extremely loyal, Sam utters the book's last words as he returns from having accompanied a psychically wounded Frodo to the end of his stay on Middle-earth. On his return, Sam says to his wife, "Well, I am back," with the ambivalence about re-entering the safe family hearth, representing enchantment's end. The bits outside the Shire, which is the single locus of cozy normality within this continent of magic land, of orc, elves and talking trees, loses its sense of enchantment. The child psychologist Donald Winnicott argues that we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater when we grow up, but to navigate and inhabit both worlds, dip into the world of our childhood magic or enchantment, on which to draw dreams and meaning while navigating the rational world of adulthood at the same time. The Tolkien books tap into the sense of melancholy many people have because they have lost more than they need to lose on entering adulthood. Their lives have a parallel in the ultimate defeat the races of Middle-earth suffer when getting rid of the ring and losing at the same time their magic. That is why, in the 20th and 21st century, Lord of the Rings has had this enormous cultural impact, and Tolkien was working from a mythology that there is a good case for having had its foundation here, near Skara, in western Sweden.